The call came in at 6:47 in the morning, and Nurse Tessa Wren was elbow-deep in a wound irrigation when the overhead pay clicked twice. The code that meant something had gone wrong at the front of the building. Not the kind of wrong that meant a patient was crashing at the other end. She heard it in the click itself. 2 beats, then silence. Someone had cut the announcement before it finished. That meant whoever was on the other end of that PA button had thought better of broadcasting. And the only reason you thought better of broadcasting in a hospital was because you didn't want whoever was causing the problem to know the cavalry was coming. Wren finished irrigating. She capped the saline, pressed a clean dressing over the wound, told the man in the bed that someone would be back to check on him in 20 minutes and walked out of the room at a pace that looked, to anyone watching, like a nurse who had somewhere routine to be. It wasn't routine. She turned left, instead of right at the nursing station, bypassed the elevator, and took the stairs down 1 floor to the main corridor of Hargrove Regional's outpatient pharmacy wing. The building was a converted teaching hospital, long and narrow, with corridors that funneled foot traffic in only 2 directions. She'd memorized the layout on her first week. Not because the orientation packet told her to, because she always did. The pharmacy window came into view through the glass panel of the stairwell door, and she stopped. There were 11 people in the waiting area. 8 were sitting. 2 were on the floor with their hands behind their heads. Not because anyone had told them to get down, but because they were the kind of people who understood, instinctively, that getting down was the correct response to the man standing at the counter with a gun pressed to the side of the pharmacist's neck. The 11th person was the pharmacist herself, a woman in her 50s named Carol, who Wren knew from the Thursday afternoon coffee rotation, and who was currently standing very still, with her eyes closed and her lips moving slightly, which meant she was either praying or counting. And either way, she was keeping it together. The man with the gun was not keeping it together. Wren clocked him in 3 seconds, late 30s. Maybe 46 feet, heavyset, wearing a canvas jacket that was too warm for the season, which meant he'd dressed to conceal and not thought past that. The gun was a Ruger SR9, compact, affordable, the kind of weapon someone bought legally at a sporting goods store and then held onto for years before one bad decision brought it out of the closet. His knuckles were white. His jaw was working. He hadn't spoken in the last several seconds, which meant he was waiting for something. The pharmacist to comply, a door to open, his nerve to steady, and the waiting was costing him. His name, Wren would learn later, was Gary Fitch. He had outstanding medical debt, a brother in hospice, a landlord who wasn't waiting any longer, and a prescription for opioids that had been flagged and denied 6 weeks ago by an insurance algorithm. He'd never been able to reach a human being to contest. He wasn't a professional. He wasn't dangerous in the way trained people were dangerous. He was desperate, which was its own category entirely, and in some ways harder to predict. He had made in the 30 seconds before Wren came down the stairs 2 significant errors. The first was choosing a pharmacy wing that had exactly 1 corridor in and 1 corridor out, which meant he had no exit strategy and no flexibility if anything went wrong. The second was not yet knowing Tessa Wren was in the building. She pushed open the stairwell door slowly, the way someone would push open any door in a hospital, deliberately, unhurried, announcing herself so she didn't startle anyone. She kept her hands visible and her shoulders soft, the posture of a person who was mildly confused and marginally concerned, not the posture of someone who was running an assessment. She was running a full assessment, the angle of his weapon arm, the distance between his body and Carol's, whether there was a second person she hadn't seen yet, the positions of the people on the floor. One of them was a man in his 60s with a hearing aid, who probably hadn't understood the full scope of what was happening yet. The other was a young woman, maybe 20, who had gone flat the moment the gun appeared, which meant good instincts or prior exposure. Either way, she wasn't going to complicate things. The waiting area chairs were plastic and bolted to the floor in rows. The counter was waist-high laminate. The window between the waiting area and the dispensary was bulletproof glass. She knew this because she'd once asked the pharmacy tech about it during a slow Tuesday. Half out of curiosity, half out of reflex. "Excuse me," Wren said. Her voice came out the way she'd learned to make it come out in situations like this. Not loud, not authoritative, not frightened, just present. The voice of someone arriving at a situation. They didn't fully understand and were trying to quietly make sense of. Fitch turned toward her. The gun stayed at Carol's neck, but his head swiveled, eyes catching on Wren with the reflexive suspicion of a man whose threat detection was running on adrenaline and cortisol and not much else. "Who are you?" he said. "Nurse," Wren said. She held up the badge clipped to her lanyard, moving it slowly enough that he could read it. "I heard something on the PA. Is everyone okay?" She looked past him toward Carol with the specific kind of mild professional concern that read as genuine. Because in a way it was. "Stay back." "I'm staying back," Wren said, and she was. She hadn't moved since the door swung shut behind her. "I just want to make sure nobody needs medical attention." It was a small thing to say and a very deliberate thing to say. She was establishing a reason to be there that had nothing to do with him. She was not a threat. She was not law enforcement. She was the person whose job it was to check on people. He had no framework for what to do with her, and that gap was exactly what she needed. Fitch's eyes moved back to Carol, then to the door on the far side of the dispensary window, the locked supply room behind it, which was presumably what he'd come for. "Open it," he said to Carol. "The back supply, open it." Carol's voice was thin. "I need a keycard. It's at the main desk." "Then go get it." "I can't. He has to release me to." Wren took 3 steps forward, not toward Fitch but toward the waiting area chairs, angling her body between 2 rows of seats in a way that looked like she was getting out of the way. She had now reduced the distance between herself and the counter by approximately 8 feet. "Sir," she said, "I don't know what's happening here. And I'm not going to pretend I do." She sat down in one of the plastic chairs, hands in her lap, scrubs a little rumpled from the morning already, stethoscope hanging loose at her collar. "But I can tell you that whatever you came here for, standing here isn't getting you any closer to it. And the longer this goes on, the more people are going to come down that corridor." Fitch looked at the corridor. It was empty. "Right now it's empty," Wren said, reading the look. "It won't stay that way." He turned back to her. "Why do you care?" It was a real question. Stripped of aggression, it was a genuine question. The question of a man who expected fear and compliance, and was getting neither, and who couldn't quite square that. Wren looked at him. Not at the gun, at him. "Because I've been doing this job for 8 years, she said. "And I've seen what happens when situations like this get to a certain point. I don't want that to happen here. Not to you, not to Carol, not to any of these people." She let a beat pass. "You don't look like someone who woke up this morning wanting to hurt anybody." Something shifted in his face, the same thing she'd seen shift in other faces in other circumstances. Not weakness. Something more complicated. The brief disorienting experience of seen by the wrong person at the worst time. "You don't know what I want," he said. "No," Wren said, "but I know what you don't want." She kept her voice level, her hands still. "You don't want this." Fitch's grip on the gun had not relaxed, but his weight had shifted. He was no longer leaning into his forward foot. He was settling back slightly, imperceptibly to anyone who wasn't measuring it, but she was measuring everything. The distance between his weapon arm and Carol's neck had increased by approximately 2 inches. Carol's eyes had opened. The young woman on the floor had moved her hands from flat to slightly braced, which meant she was thinking about options, which meant Wren needed to move before someone else did something she couldn't predict. "Carol," Wren said, keeping her eyes on Fitch, "can you step to your left, please?" Slowly. "Just a step." Carol moved. Fitch's head turned a fraction toward Carol. The instinctive tracking of movement, and Wren was already rising from the chair. Not fast, not sharp. The kind of fluid, unhurried rise that her body had rehearsed so many times. It no longer registered as a decision. And she was across the room in the time it takes most people to register that someone has stood up. Her left hand came around the outside of his weapon arm at the wrist, fingers finding the specific groove between the radius and ulna, and pressing inward and down with precisely enough force to trigger the radial nerve reflex without breaking anything. The gun dropped 3 inches, muzzle pointing at the floor. Her right hand came up simultaneously and covered the top of the slide. Thumb indexed along the frame, locking the action so that even if he managed to tighten his finger, nothing would cycle. She stepped into him, used his own backward stumble against him, turned her hip into his center of mass, and the gun came free. It took approximately 4 seconds. Wren stepped back. She held the gun at low, ready, muzzle down, not pointed at him, just held. Present, controlled, unambiguous. Fitch stood against the dispensary counter with his mouth slightly open, and his right hand held against his chest. risking the expression on his face. One she had seen before on men who had believed themselves, until approximately 5 seconds ago, to be the most dangerous person in any room they walked into. "Sit down," Wren said. He sat. He sat in the chair nearest to him, not the one she'd vacated but the one directly behind him, and he sat in it the way a man sits when his legs have made the decision before his mind has caught up. "Carol," Wren said. "Yes." Carol's voice had steadied by a degree. "Call security. Tell them pharmacy wing, no injuries, situation contained."
Use those words.
Carol was already reaching for the phone. The young woman on the floor had gotten to her knees. She was staring at Wren, with the particular expression of someone who is trying to reconcile what they just watched with what they thought they knew about the world. The man with the hearing aid had not fully understood that it was over. Wren set the Ruger on the counter behind her out of reach, and turned to look at Fitch. He was sitting, with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. The canvas jacket had ridden up at the back, showing a strip of gray shirt. He looked in that posture much less like a threat, and much more like a man who had run out of every other option before arriving at this one. "Your wrist is going to hurt for about 20 minutes, she said. "After that it'll be fine. I didn't damage anything." He didn't respond. "Is there someone I should call?" she said. "Family." He shook his head, then stopped. Then said quietly, "My brother." "Okay," Wren said. "What's his name?" he told her. She filed it away. Security arrived in the next 60 seconds. 2 officers, one of whom immediately positioned himself between Wren and Fitch, and the other of whom began clearing the waiting area in the brisk professional way that told her he'd had training beyond the standard hospital's cert. She gave them a full verbal briefing in under 90 seconds. Fitch's full name, which she'd gotten from the prescription form, still clutched in his jacket pocket. She'd read it during her approach and committed it without acknowledging she'd done so. The type and condition of the weapon, now bagged, the medical note about the wrist, the request to contact the brother. The senior officer looked at the bagged Ruger on the counter, then at Wren, then back at the gun. "Are you all right?" he said. She was already filling in the incident section of Carol's pharmacy log, which had been left open on the counter, because the paperwork existed for a reason, and someone was going to need it. "Tachycardia in the patient," she said, completing the entry. "Wrist contusion left hand. He should be evaluated before processing." She clicked the pen closed. "Everyone else is fine. I have a patient upstairs I need to get back to." She unclipped the pen, returned it to the counter and walked back to the stairwell door. Behind her, she could hear one of the officers explaining something to the young woman who'd been on the floor, answering a question about what had just happened. The young woman's voice was still high, still processing. Wren took the stairs 2 at a time, not because she was in a hurry, but because she had genuinely been gone longer than 20 minutes, and the man with the wound irrigation was probably starting to wonder. She'd been working the floor at Hargrove Regional for 3 years. Before that, 4 years at a trauma center in Phoenix. Before that, something else entirely, in places that didn't appear on her employment history, under classifications that didn't get summarized in exit interviews. She had been in the Joint Personnel Recovery Agency's medical support track for 7 years, working with air instructors and combat rescue officers in environments that her colleagues at Hargrove couldn't have located on a map and wouldn't have lasted 48 hours in. She had pulled people out of situations that made a desperate man with a Ruger in a pharmacy wing look like a bad Tuesday. She had done things with a tourniquet, a pair of trauma shears and 40 seconds that trauma surgeons with twice her years and 3 times her equipment hadn't been able to replicate. She had left, not because she was broken by it, and not because she'd lost her nerve, but because she had decided at 31 that the particular skill set she'd spent a decade building was more useful quietly, in a place where people didn't know she had it, in a place where she could do the work without the machinery around it, in a place where she could be to the people who needed her, just a nurse. She pushed through the stairwell door on the 2nd floor and turned right toward the wound care suite. The man in the bed was reading a magazine from the table beside him, the kind of man who adapted quickly to unexpected delays, and he looked up when she came in with the mild, uncomplicated relief of someone who'd genuinely been wondering if they'd been forgotten. "Sorry," Wren said. Got held up downstairs. She pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, lifted the dressing, assessed the wound with the same quiet precision she brought to everything, and reached for the saline. "All good?" the man said. Looking good, Wren said. Another few days, and you won't even know it was there. She meant the wound. There was something else she meant, though she didn't say it. Something that applied to the whole morning, to the pharmacy wing, and the bagged Ruger and Victor Fitch, sitting in a plastic chair with his face in his hands. The hospital would process the incident report. The security team would write their summary. The officers would do their intake, and at no point in any of those documents would the name, Tessa Wren, appear in any context that's XX by explanation. She would be listed as staff present, first responder, secured the weapon. The how would not appear in the report, because no one who wrote the report would know how to describe it, and she would not be explaining it to them. That was the arrangement, not formal, not written anywhere, just understood. The implicit agreement she had made with herself the day she walked out of her exit debrief and drove to Phoenix and filled out a nursing application. She would be exactly what the badge said she was. She would do the work, she would not make it complicated, and if the work occasionally required something more than the work, she would handle that too, and she would do it cleanly, and she would go back to what she was doing before anyone had time to ask the questions she wasn't going to answer. The wound looked clean. She dressed it with the same care she brought to all of them, methodical and precise and present, because precision was the thing, in every context, under every circumstance, that she had never been able to set down. She capped the saline, disposed of the old dressing, stripped her gloves and updated the chart. Standing at the counter beside the sink, down the hall somewhere past the nursing station, she could hear the PA system clicking back on. Normal now, routine, a page for a respiratory tech. The mundane sound of a hospital that had remembered how to function. She finished the chart entry, clipped the pen and went to find her next patient. The morning was still young, it always was.